All right, y'all, welcome to the show. I got a big-ass show for you today. So we're going to talk in a second about updates coming out of Israel. They bombed Rafah. We'll get to attacks in the West Bank now as well. Iraq got bombed by Israel, so they're going all out. And by the way, at this late date in the conflict, it's not getting nearly as much coverage as it should get. Now, Israeli attacks are greeted mostly with a yawn in Western media. But that doesn't mean it's not happening, and that doesn't mean that you don't have innocent victims getting murked on a daily basis. So we'll dive into that. I'll also get to Columbia University erupting in pro-Palestine protests, and of course those protesters are getting viciously smeared. Later on, we have Tucker versus Joe Rogan. That got interesting. Tucker denies evolution to Rogan's face, something that really perplexes Rogan. Tucker also talks about supernatural entities. I don't know if he's talking about ghosts or aliens or a mix or whatever, but super weird. So I have a bunch of clips from that. Then we'll also get to Congress spending the weekend passing the most disgusting bills you've ever seen. Trump allegedly can't stop farting in the courtroom. We'll get to the guy who set himself on fire and self-immolated outside of the Trump trial. And of course, Bill Maher cannot stop turning into a Republican. Every single day, it is getting worse. I will prove it. Okay. So everybody do me a big favor. Subscribe to the channel. It helps out massively in the algorithm. It costs you nothing at all. So hook a brother up with a sub. I would deeply, deeply appreciate it. And by the way, thank you to everybody who supports this channel on Patreon or tips on YouTube. We can't do it without you. I've never talked to an advertiser. I'm very proud of that fact. You guys make that possible. So thank you very much. And if you are not a Patreon supporter, please consider a link below. All right, let's go ahead and dive into it here. So guys, right off the bat, the thing that we desperately did not want to happen just happened. The IDF was striking the southern Gaza city of Rafah, killing at least 22, mostly children. Mostly children. Now, this is at the same time that the U.S. is sending more money and weapons to Israel. More on that later. I'll give you specifics about all the terrible bills that Congress passed over the weekend. But guys, understand something. Rafah is the last place in Gaza that was considered somewhat safe. Relatively safe. North Gaza is destroyed, basically wiped off the map. You had 1 million Palestinians shoved into Rafah, which is honestly a tiny space. It was compared to like the size of LAX airport. You had 1 million people in there, just hoping, praying that Israel is not going to bomb them. Israel is not going to kill them. All the civilians are there. Well, Israel just decided to do some bombing there. Now, by the way, will they continue? Maybe. Will they do a ground invasion? Maybe. We don't know. But remember, the reporting over the weekend was like, oh, Biden made a deal with Netanyahu. I will let you do a Rafah invasion, but only if you don't do a retaliatory strike against Iran. This was the reporting. Well, what happened since then? Netanyahu both attacked Iran and started bombing Rafah. So either that reporting is fake or Biden just got played by Netanyahu again. Absolutely pathetic. So we'll see what happens there in the next few days. But, hope for the best, but fear the worst, because every step of the way, Israel has been far worse than any of us could imagine with how vicious they are towards innocent civilians, women, children. All right, now, at the same time, we got to talk about this. There's now a massive crackdown happening in the West Bank. So, by the way, this is how you know that the argument from the IDF, who, us? No, we're just defending ourselves against Hamas. We're just going after the bad guys that attacked us on October 7th. This is how you know that's bullshit. Because there's been a massive uptick in violence by Israelis against Palestinians in the West Bank, where there is no Hamas. So, here's a video. They're absolutely destroying innocent villages. Watch this. Worst destruction in decades in the occupied West Bank.
The Israeli military went into Nur Shams refugee camp east of Tulkarem late Thursday night, and on early Friday morning they were still there. And in 12 hours of raids, they destroyed roads, buildings, shops, houses, tore up sewage lines. We've been to this camp, we've seen these roads before, we've seen this kind of destruction before. And those alleyways, those roads that we're seeing in the videos now were repaired mere months ago. But locals
Oh. So the IDF destroyed these Palestinian villages not that long ago, and then as soon as the work was completed to fix the roads that they tore up and the other issues they had, the IDF goes in there again and destroys everything.
The mayhem being carried out on Thursday night into Friday morning by the Israeli military as the worst destruction of infrastructure that they've seen in the West Bank since the destruction of the Jenin refugee camp during the Second Intifada in the early 2000s. Now, the area of Tulkarem is no stranger to these kinds of raids, but what residents are saying, the opinion that now locals are voicing is the same thing we've been hearing since the beginning of the war on Gaza. They are worried that this escalation in intensity is a signal that once the Israeli military is done with Gaza, that the West Bank will be next.
Guys, they tore up sewage lines. In what world can you conceivably make an argument we had to tear up the sewage lines for the civilians in the West Bank because Hamas? That's not a thing. That's not an argument. They are simply targeting innocent civilians on purpose. And again, at this late date, if you don't see it, I have to question your intelligence or your honesty. You pick which one. All right, so we also have this. There are some reports that there were multiple strikes targeting Iranian-backed militias and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iraq. There are 8 dead as a result of it. Now, remember, guys, there was reporting the same day that Israel attacked Iran, there was reporting, hey, they also attacked in Syria and in Iraq. It turns out the reports on that day of attacks in Syria and Iraq were untrue. But they have since done at least one strike in Iraq going after top Shia proxies of Iran. So yet again, totally unhinged. They want a broader war. Netanyahu has always wanted that. All right, so another thing, we now have new evidence, new video, new pictures of a brand new mass grave outside of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis. At least 150 bodies have been found in the past 2 days. So by the way, there's all this talk about, I think that the death count is overblown by the Gaza Health Ministry because they're run by Hamas. Now, in previous conflicts, the Gaza Health Ministry has been relatively accurate with their numbers. So that notion is sort of bullshit when you question it. But if you're going to question in any direction, it's not that they're overcounting. If anything, it's that they're undercounting. There's only one outlet I know of that counts among the dead people who've been under the rubble for weeks. Okay, that's Euromed Monitor. But there's also, now we're coming across new mass graves that nobody knew about. How many of these are there? That's a super important question. And I don't think one that anybody has an answer to. But the answer is certainly not just one. So the death toll may be way higher than even the highest estimate. Imran Siddiqui says here, I've never seen the uncovering of mass graves being taken so lightly by the Western media. Students feel unsafe, though. More on that in a minute, because that's a reference to the Columbia University protests and the vicious reaction and the smearing of the protesters by the media and by a bunch of bad faith actors. Yeah, this is kind of a bigger story. A new mass grave uncovered in Gaza and absolute crickets. It's almost like people have gotten accustomed to Israeli brutality and viciousness and genocide. They've gotten accustomed to it. So when there's a new mass grave found, it barely is a blip in the radar. That's insane. We have to recalibrate our moral outrage meter because right now it is beyond broken. All right. So a little bit of good news to sprinkle in amidst all this horrible news. Apparently Netanyahu's office had emergency talks because they are fearing that the International Criminal Court is going to issue arrest warrants, not just for Netanyahu, but a bunch of other ministers who are directly involved in the genocide. So apparently they are actually worried that, the international court is going to be like, hey, you're such a criminal and it's so extreme and you're doing so many war crimes and this is so unhinged that we are going to legitimately try to lock your ass up. Well, I know it's cold comfort, but fact of the matter is at least homie's not going to bed and sleeping like a baby. At least he's actually worried, like, damn, there might be some consequences for my insane actions. All right, so now let me give you this one. This guy, Barak Ravid, who's a reporter for Axios, his whole job throughout this whole conflict has been to try to make it look like Joe Biden is being tougher on Netanyahu and Israel than he actually is. I say that because this is the guy who was the source of so many of the stories that are like, Biden's really angry. Biden called Netanyahu an asshole behind the scenes. Biden says, hey, can you please reduce the war crimes just a little bit? This is the guy who leaks all of those stories. That's really just PR ass covering by the White House, but he's the guy who's feeding that narrative. Well, now we get this from him. Scoop, U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken is expected to announce within days sanctions against the IDF forces Netzah Yehuda Battalion for human rights violations in the occupied West Bank. So this is one of the most extreme, one of the most criminal branches of the IDF. And he's saying that the U.S. is going to sanction this group. Now, by the way, don't hold your breath for this because Biden also sanctioned some of the worst, most extreme illegal Israeli settlers. I forget how many. It was like 2 or 5 or something like that. But then within like a month or two, he rolled back all those sanctions. So again, it was just a little virtue signal move. I'm against the extremists in Israel. See, I sanctioned the worst illegal settlers. But then he rolled it back when nobody was looking. So it might be a similar thing in this instance. He might do the sanctions and roll them back later, or do the sanctions, but they're just sort of sanctions in name only. They're weak. They don't get anything accomplished. But either way, I mean, the overwhelmingly obvious takeaway is I doubt this is going to have any teeth. It's more for show. Biden knows he has a problem with his own voters who don't approve of his support of Israel. And so this is the way that he tries to split the difference and be like, I'm with Israel, but also I don't like the extreme stuff coming out of there. All right, more. So Senator Bill Hagerty responded to that story I just told you about the IDF unit, which might get sanctioned, as Israel fights on multiple fronts against terrorists and a terror-supporting state that openly vows to destroy it. The Biden administration is sanctioning the IDF to appease the pro-Hamas radical left. Absolutely shameful. This guy's a moron. As Zed Jelani says, here a U.S. senator says that an Israeli unit that was found to be torturing elderly people to death should continue to receive U.S. taxpayer aid and American weapons. Where was he radicalized? What university did he attend? So here you just have an outright defense of an Israeli unit that it has been proven they've tortured elderly people to death. And he's like, how dare you? If you criticize them, if you sanction them, if you cut off their money, you're Hamas. It's beyond comical. I told you guys, what this conflict has taught me is you don't have to look too deep beneath the surface to find that plenty of people who have a tremendous amount of political power are like, I'm a Nazi. I believe Nazi things. I mean, it is right there underneath the surface. It's a millimeter underneath. And they're all exposing themselves with what Israel is doing. Okay, more. The Israeli army employs a new tactic using recorded sounds of crying infants and women screaming to lure civilians and kill them. This is what Euromed Monitor documented in Nuseirat refugee camp in the central Gaza Strip. Does it get any darker than that? This is like when we learned recently of the Daddy's Home program where the IDF would wait for a Hamas official to go home and knowing, hey, the wife is there. Hey, 4 children are there with them. Knowing that fact, they would blow them up when they were at home. Purposely killing the woman and the 4 children along with the alleged Hamas fighter. This is as depraved as it gets. Guys, bottom line, they don't view Palestinian civilians as civilians. They don't view them as innocent. I know, because that's what they said. That's what they said how they feel is. Are we just going to sit here and let it happen? Are we just going to keep arming it and funding it and supporting it? Apparently the answer is yes. Itamar Ben-Gvir, Israel's far-right national security minister, whom Netanyahu depends on to stay in power and avoid prison on corruption charges, has called for the execution of Palestinian prisoners to ease overcrowding in the country's jails. Guys, there are thousands of Palestinian, they call them prisoners. They're hostages. They're hostages. There's no formal charges against these people. They're hostages. He says, yeah, let's execute thousands of Palestinians on a whim because our jails are overcrowded. Again, outright genocidal. Total Nazi shit. By the way, the exact number of hostages held by Israel, 3,890. That's how many Ben-Gvir wants to kill. So, by the way, these are the numbers we have. Again, this came out on April 3rd, so the number is definitely higher now. But I'm sure Euromed Monitor is stretched super thin. They don't have the infrastructure, barely have the ability to keep track of this stuff. But at least as of April 3rd, 41,496 Palestinians had been killed. Of those, 37,676 are civilians. Over 15,000 children, over 9,000 women, over 77,000 injured people, 136 journalists killed. That's the most deadly conflict for journalists ever. 2 million out of the 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza are now homeless. There's been over 122,000 homes completely destroyed, over 269,000 homes that are partially destroyed that you still can't live in, 443 schools that have been attacked, 301 healthcare facilities. The list goes on and on. It's disgusting. Now, I give you all of that to give you this. Benjamin Netanyahu is now stronger than ever since October 7th, according to new polls from Israel. The survey also highlights a tightening race for the prime minister, with Benny Gantz, who received 42% of the support, compared to Benjamin Netanyahu's 37%. So he's losing to Benny Gantz, but he's the highest that he's been since October 7th. In two recent surveys, the Likud party and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have received the highest levels of support since the October 7th massacre. In the first war, conducted by Mariv, the Likud party has reached a new high since the onset of the conflict, marking significant gains in public support. The poll, spearheaded by Lazar Research in collaboration with Panel for All, indicates that Likud now holds 21 seats, a peak since the Swords of Iron War began on October 7th. Is that what they call this thing? Swords of Iron? This surge came amidst ongoing tensions and the recent thwarting of an Iranian attack. The survey also highlights a tightening race for the prime minister, with Benny Gantz receiving 42% of the support compared with Benjamin Netanyahu's 37%. The gap between the two has significantly narrowed, with Gantz lead shrinking from 12% to just over 5% over the last week. According to the Mariv survey, the National Union Party leads with 31 seats, while the dramatic shifts in public opinion reflect the volatile political landscape in Israel during this tumultuous period. The survey included 500 respondents. Okay, blah, blah, blah. So, best position that he's been in since October 7th. He has gone back up in the polls since October 7th, and if elections were held today, it would actually be a close race between him and Benny Gantz. Look, I'm sorry, but this falls directly in line with that other poll that came out in the wake of, I don't know, maybe it was like a month since October 7th, and Israel was already effectively trying to wipe Gaza off the map. Or maybe it was like 2 or 3 months in. Anyway, the poll said it was only something like 4% of Israelis thought the IDF was using too much force in Gaza. So already at a time where we had thousands of dead kids, thousands of dead women, thousands of innocent civilians killed, already at a time when infrastructure was clearly being targeted, already at a time when they announced the medieval siege to cut off food, fuel, water, and electricity to 2.3 million people, the Israeli population was like, yeah, that's fine. That's not too much. I'm cool with that. So, understand, they are in the midst of an absolute psychotic break. They are in a state of hysteria and mania. It's not dissimilar from what the U.S. was like after 9/11, where, George W. Bush had like an 80% or 90% approval rating as they were plotting an all-out war on a country that didn't attack us and lying about it in the process. I mean, there is a war fever that has swept the country. And so now they're not too upset with Netanyahu. Think about all the war crimes, all the genocide, all the ethnic cleansing, all the torture, every horrible policy imaginable, and he's still hanging in there in a potential race. By the way, that's not to say Benny Gantz would be better. He's also an absolute fucking psychopath. There is really no left option in Israel. That should be obvious to you guys by this point. But the fact that the population feels about him the way they do, man, is that telling. Okay. Look at this, guys. Quote, We should have seen a lot more revenge, a lot more rivers of Gazans' blood, expressed Israeli journalist Yehuda Schlesinger during an Israeli channel interview. Schlesinger was triggered upon seeing Palestinians at the beach in Gaza calling for more Palestinians to be annihilated as there are no innocents in the Strip. So yet again, the kind of genocidal language that we hear every day in Israel from politicians, from media figures, and from the population. And Zedjulani here says, Israeli government arrested an Arab citizen and professor who opposed the war, saying she was engaged in incitement. As you can see, those incitement laws don't seem to apply to Israeli Jews. So you could be as genocidal as you want to be. You could openly call for killing civilians, women, children, etc. And you're not violating the incitement laws. It's okay if you incite against Palestinians. But if you oppose the war, then, oh no, you're inciting. And you're like being traitorous. And you're undermining national security or whatever, and they arrest you. No free speech, total authoritarianism, but again, it only cuts in one direction. The freedom only cuts in one direction. You have freedom to be as vicious and genocidal as you want to be, as long as you're talking about the Palestinians. Okay. New CBS YouGov poll about sending more weapons and supplies to Israel. So, 40% support it, sending more weapons to Israel. 60% oppose it. So it's 20 points underwater. Among Democrats, only 32% support sending more money and weapons to Israel. Among independents, only 38% support sending more money and weapons to Israel. Republicans, that's the only group that's above water. 55% support sending money and weapons to Israel. Now, again, we'll do a separate segment on this in a little bit, but the House had a vote on another package to send billions of dollars in weapons and aid to Israel. And what was the result? And this is among Democrats. 82% of Democrats voted in favor of sending the money and weapons to Israel. 82%. And that's to say nothing of the Republicans, which I think it's every Republican but Massey voted in favor of it. Completely and utterly abdicating their duty to their constituents. Not representing the will of the people at all. By the way, I wonder why. I wonder why that is. Could it be partly ideological? Sure. In part, it can be, sure. But another giant part of it is AIPAC and DMFI and the Israel lobby and the millions and millions of dollars they spend in campaign contributions, which buys loyalty from these politicians. When Ilhan Omar said, it's all about the Benjamins, talking about AIPAC, she was 100% right. She's talking about the power of money and lobbyists in Washington, D.C. She's not saying anything anti-Semitic and blaming all Jews. She's saying the Israel lobby is strong and powerful for the same reason the Saudi lobby is strong and powerful. They buy support. They buy votes in a particular direction when they spend millions in campaign contributions. You know, Wall Street, there's a big financial lobby. Why do you think our government always votes for more deregulation, always votes for more bailouts for these companies? It's because they have effectively bought the politicians. It's the same with AIPAC. Who are we kidding? This story was wild. Google CEO tells staffers the office is not a place to debate politics after firing 28 for anti-Israel sit-ins. So you had some employees at Google sit in their boss's office to say, hey, we don't want to be involved with any sort of technology that enforces apartheid and commits genocide, right? We don't want to help Israel in any way, shape, or form in this scenario because we feel like it's immoral. By the way, hilarious. Wasn't Google's catchphrase thing, don't be evil or something like that? And now they're like, evil, yes. They should change it to evil, hooray. So what happened? Everybody who expressed concern about technology that they're developing that could help Israel commit crimes, they were fired. They fired 28. You want to talk about cancel culture? You can't even voice disapproval about this? Seems like something perfectly reasonable to be upset about, isn't it? Here's your cancel culture. Here's your crackdown on free speech and free expression. All right, now let's talk about the Colombia thing, man. So this is a big deal. You had these massive pro-Palestine protests in Colombia. And Man, did it trigger the higher-ups, people at the top of Columbia University. They were furious about it. They wanted the NYPD to come in and start arresting people. Now, by the way, this is a classic example of free speech and free expression. They have a right to protest, especially something as serious as what's happening in Gaza. Well, no. According to the higher-ups at the university, this is unacceptable. So they wanted the NYPD to go in there and start laying down the law. And that's exactly what happened. The NYPD came in. They arrested a bunch of students in the overwhelming majority of instances for total bullshit. You know, they really had no right to arrest them, but they did arrest them. And then guess what? The next day, even more students showed up. They said, oh, hell no. Fuck this. It's really reminiscent of the old school anti-Vietnam War protests, right? That's what it feels like. It feels very, very similar to that. So let me show you a little video about what's been going down, and then I'll give you some more about how these people are getting smeared to the high heavens. Here we go. Oh, yeah, I forgot to point this out, too, that the university suspended the daughter of Representative Ilhan Omar. She's one of the leading organizers of what they're doing, of what the protesters are doing. And they suspended her. And by the way, they also suspended her like a day after Ilhan Omar was aggressively questioning. I don't know if it was the head of Columbia University in particular. It may have been the head of Columbia University specifically. Aggressively questioning how censorious and authoritarian they've been. So they're saying, it's for those of you who are just listening to this and you can't see what's on the screen, they're basically comparing this to how it was inspired by the anti-Vietnam War protests. Oh, and that's one of their demands right there. 1,000 students occupied 5 buildings demanding the school cut ties with a Pentagon War Research think tank. Oh, that was for the 1968 protest, I believe it was. Over 100 students set up an encampment on a university lawn on April 17th. They called it the Liberated Zone and Gaza's Solidarity Encampment. Working in the pre-dawn hours to avoid campus security. Their numbers grew throughout the day. Administrators responded by closing the campus to the public and calling the NYPD. By the way, that is a bitch-ass move. This is a peaceful protest. Why are you closing the campus? Why are you calling the NYPD? It's almost like you're more offended by the disorder than the genocide that they're protesting. It's almost like you might not agree with the core of why they're protesting. Activists say hundreds of supporters arrived within 20 minutes after rumors of imminent mass arrests. The following morning, police arrested students on a sidewalk in front of the university.
I'm just standing on the sidewalk. What's wrong with you?
A few hours later, the NYPD swept the encampment.
The president of Columbia just sent an email saying that she gave NYPD the authority to come in. We saw police and riot gear coming in with like batons and zip ties.
Where are all the free speech warriors? Where are you? Ben Shapiro, Dave Rubin, whoever else postured as a First Amendment warrior. Where the hell are you? Oh, that's right, you're silent. And you're going to remain silent because these students are protesting Israel and you love Israel. So again, please spare me all of the virtue signaling and posturing and the we are the last bastions of freedom and space, yes! Apparently not. Apparently not, because you got dick to say about this.
You are currently participating in an automobile.
Police arrested at least 100 people. Now get this, guys. Columbia previously suspended chapters of Jewish Voice for Peace and Students for Justice in Palestine. They suspended those chapters. By the way, if we want to play the same game they play, why are you being anti-Semitic? You are censoring and doing an authoritarian crackdown on Jewish Voice for Peace. You're telling Jewish students they can't have free speech and free expression? To have disapproval over what Israel is doing in Gaza? Why are you guys so anti-Semitic? Several colleges around the world have voted to cut ties with Israel in recent months. By the way, they also want Columbia to do that. And now they go on to explain what's going on in Gaza, which we all know in detail, unfortunately. But in response to this, I mean, okay, there's more talk about this than there is about the new mass grave that was just found in Gaza with 150 innocent people in it. There's more talk about this than Israel bombing Rafah and killing 22 people, most of them children. There's more talk about this than Israel bombing Iraq. There's more talk about this than any of the updates that we're getting from Israel, including the new crackdown in the West Bank, where they're bulldozing an innocent village and ripping up the roads and destroying the sewer lines. There's more talk about this, and you'll never guess what side the media is on and what side the higher-ups are on. You'll never guess. There's this guy, Shea Davide, who's been going around basically accusing the protesters of all being Hamas supporters and wanting more October 7ths. He's now calling Columbia University because they're not doing a full and complete crackdown on the protests. He's calling them basically Hamas supporters and terrorists. Out-and-out smear campaign. Out-and-out smear campaign against students who are protesting for peace. So here's another example of what's going on here. Jake Tapper says this. In response to horrific scenes of anti-Semitic harassment at and around campus, the Orthodox rabbi at Columbia and Barnard sent a WhatsApp message to more than 290-plus Jewish students this morning, recommending that they go home until it's safe again for them on campus. By the way, it is Jewish Voice for Peace. It is anti-Zionist Jews who are the ones being censored, who are the ones facing an authoritarian crackdown, who are the ones who were arrested and part of the sweep of the encampment. It's anti-Zionist Jews. It is pro-Palestine Jews who are facing. They have nothing to say about them. Instead, what do? Cook up imaginary scenarios about how it's unsafe for Zionist Jews on campus. Do they have one example of an anti-Semitic incident? They do not. What they'll do is what they always do. Point to, oh my God, these people were saying from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I am interpreting that as a call for genocide, even though it's not. So something, Hamas uses the same phrase, even though when they say it, they mean it in a totally different way. It's anti-Semitic enough, pro-terrorist enough. So this is anti-Semitism. The guy, Shea Davide, had a video of like, here Israel supporters are being chased off campus or something. And you watch the video, it is totally unclear what's happening in the video. Totally unclear what's happening in the video. The idea that that's some like pound the gavel moment, the only thing they could point to and even make a stretch of a case that it's fucked up is that there's a bunch of pro-Israel students, Zionist students, waving Israeli flags, and then you have somebody who shows up holding a sign saying, like, Al-Qassam's, that's the military wing of Hamas, basically like Hamas's next target, and it's got an arrow pointing at them. And they look at, oh my God, they're calling in an attack directly from Hamas! In reality, what is it? It's a joke, right? This person doesn't have freaking Hamas connections. But if you want to say, hey, that goes too far, hey, that's too much, okay, whatever, I'll take it, that's fair. Let's not pretend like this student protester has Hamas connections and is actually threatening the lives of these Zionist students. Again, the ones who are facing the brunt of a crackdown are the anti-Zionist, pro-Palestine Jews in a group like Jewish Voice for Peace. Instead, what are they doing? They're doing this bullshit tap dance of like, free speech is unacceptable, free protest is unacceptable, because we're going to say you're hurting the feelings of Zionist Jews. Fuck out of here. Now who's the snowflakes? Now who's supporting cancel culture? Jesus Christ. All right. And then the last, we'll end on this one right here, okay? The U.S. decided to reimpose sanctions on Venezuela as hopes for democracy crumble. So the U.S. looked at everything going on around the world, and they said, you know what we need to do? Sanction Venezuela. You want to know why? Because they're acting very badly. Venezuela is really unhinged. Venezuela is really out of control. Venezuela doesn't seem to care about the laws and the rules. So we need to sanction them. You can't make up how comical this is. We are arming and funding and watching Israel commit a genocide and ethnic cleansing on a daily basis, killing over 40,000 Palestinians, torturing people, bombing hospitals, schools, mosques, churches, marketplaces, UN buildings, you name it. We've seen every war crime in the book, every day. They bombed Iran. They bombed Iraq. They're attacking the West Bank. They are completely and utterly unhinged. And the U.S. says, we need to sanction Venezuela because they're not acting right. How am I supposed to take you seriously? How can I take you seriously if this is what you're doing? I can't, and neither should you. We are now through the looking glass. We live in a fucking circus, and it's absolutely tragic and disgusting and dark. Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.